Strength in Leos.
How's it going, everybody? It's Evan back with the Strength in Leos podcast. I hope everybody's having a great day as they're listening and watching to this podcast. I hope you guys are really just enjoying the content we've been putting out lately. And with that, we have another great guest on this episode of the podcast, Zach Loughman. How's it going? Welcome to the podcast.
Hi there. It's going great.
Nice. So for anybody who's not really familiar with who you are and a little bit about the work that you do both professionally and then just as a hobbyist into reptiles, can you give a little bit of background and a bit of bio of who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I am a professor of biology at West Liberty University. I have been interested in reptiles as long as I've been on the planet, and I have kind of an interesting backstory. I'm 43, so I was an 80s and a 90s kid, and in the mid 90s, I guess it would be, that's when I got into keeping reptiles, and while I was in high school. I did that all through college. I went to university to become a herpetologist. At the time, Steve Irwin, Jeff Corwin, Mark O'Shea, all those guys were all over Animal Planet. It was super. Everybody wanted to be a herpetologist back then, and the job market actually kind of got flooded. So I went and I got my undergrad and my master's degree in herpetology, or not in herpetology, but in biology with a herpetological focus. And while in grad school, my advisor advised me to look at other animals. I messed around with centipedes, leeches, and kind of stumbled onto crayfish, and they were a perfect fit for me. So in 2004, I kind of segued away from herps professionally into crayfish, and then I was pretty much a full-time crayfish biologist when I graduated with my master's degree, got my job here at the university in 2006, and I was doing crayfish biology full-time, like I said, and then 2016, in 2015, we hired a new professor here. I was kind of in charge of the ecology program at the time. We really weren't a program yet. We are now because of this major I'm about to talk about. And the professor had an AZA zoo background. He also happened to be one of my friends. And so when we hired him, he said, we need to do this thing called a zoo science major. And I was kind of like, I don't know what that is, but it sounds fun. So we did all the paperwork and everything you got to do to create a major. In the spring of 2016, we got permission to have the major, and it was supposed to be that Dr. Greathouse was going to run the zoo science major. I was going to run the ecology side of things. And then Dr. Greathouse was such an overachiever, he got offered a job to be the director of our partner zoo. So, of course, we wanted him to take that. And then I was, infamously had a hallway conversation, as we call them, and was told, "Hi, Zach, you're now in charge of the zoo science major," to which I responded with, "What?" Okay. And so I had some conversations with my bosses and basically said, well, if I'm going to do this, we're going to fill this building with reptiles and amphibians, and we're going to teach students how to be animal keepers with a live animal collection. We're not going to talk about doing a zoo science major and not actually do it. And so I got to live my 20-year-old dream of creating a reptile collection in a very large space. So we very quickly went from having, I think we had a lab corn snake and a snapping turtle in 2015. By the end of 2016 and 2017, we had bunches of crested geckos, lychees, chihuahuas. We got leopard geckos. Not many, but we had a few. I picked up a large water monitor that we built a very large enclosure for. And then fast forward to today, and that major's grown exponentially. And currently in the building I'm sitting in right now, we have 400-ish animals. Most of those are herps. And I also created a graduate program here in zoo science. To my knowledge, we're the only zoo science master's degree on planet Earth where you go to school for zoo science specifically to get your graduate degree. And so that means that I have to come up with research projects for the graduate students. And so I realized that I needed a lab. So now I have a crayfish lab. The crayfish are still there, but I'm actually doing herpetology and herpetoculture in a research setting. So that's been a ton of fun. There's a guy in the snake world. His name is Dr. Warren Booth, and he talks about how he studies like agricultural insect evolution. But then he's been a snake nerd his whole life, so he studies parthenogenesis in snakes too, because that's both genetic. Takes a genetic background, and he refers to the snake work as his hobby research. And I really like that term because when I do this herpetocultural stuff, I only take on questions that I'm really interested in an incredibly deep, nerdy level, and I get to pretty much geek out with the animals that I love, answering questions that make herpetoculture a better practice. So that's kind of me in a nutshell. I'm also pretty busy because I try to kind of have my cake and eat it too, because I also do a tremendous amount of field research with the crayfishes. So I'm kind of all over the place and doing stuff here. So yeah.
That's awesome. You're like Superman over here, going, trying to get your hand in everything, and just everything from the crayfish, and then herpetology as well, and research, and even like starting departments at universities. Like, that's not easy work to do, especially at the university level, and how academia could be with politics and things like that. Yeah, so
that's very insane. True. I'm blessed. I'm at the college I went to, so I've been going here like literally half of my life. Like, where I'm sitting is now my office, but when I was a undergrad here, this was the student study. So I always laugh that like literally like this space that I am sitting in, I was sitting in when I was 19 and 20, studying for physics tests that I would ultimately fail. So that's kind of, that's my background in a nutshell.
Wow. And even in terms of like zoo science and how rare that major is, I think a lot of people who want to get into herpetology and want to study herps, they're looking for herpetology majors. And I guess to the best of my ability, I don't even think those exist, like going to school for herpetology as a degree.
Yeah, that's something that I hear a lot on podcasts. You cannot go to college and get a herpetology degree. You're absolutely correct. If you want to be a herpetologist, you're going to go to college and get a biology degree, and then hopefully when you're doing your undergraduate research, there's a professor at that institution that's able to either give you the opportunity to work with herps or works with herps themselves and then needs research assistance. And so you kind of get that boots on the ground field experience. And then when people really get into doing like research in an academic setting, that's what graduate school in biology is all about. So I have a bunch of graduate students, probably too many by some people's standards. But they take on projects where they're literally like in the thick of it with the animals, gathering raw data that we call it novel. People haven't gathered it before. And then you're going to look at that data statistically, write up a paper, and then hopefully produce either something that challenges an idea that already exists, or create a new idea, or maybe just create a document that kind of takes all the little isolated facts about a certain topic and congloms them into one publication. And that's when you're actually doing the, like, to do air quotes, herpetology, is when you're working at the grad level.
Nice. Yeah. Well, that's cool to clear that up for a lot of people out there, because I know that's kind of a thing that's just spewed out there for all those people. But in terms of the crayfish, and specifically for you and on your journey, did you find that as kind of like a way to get into deeper level research into other things in the future? I know a lot of people, when they get into research and they study biology in undergrad, then go into the future, a lot of people do a lot of things that they're not really interested in just to get on to further things. Was that the case for you, or how were your interest peaked through the crayfish?
So I had a moment with my graduate advisor. He was a wonderful man named Dr. Tom Polly. He was the state herpetologist for West Virginia, basically, and he had a herpetology lab at Marshall University, where I got my degree. And Dr. Pauly's lab was all field-based. There was nothing that involved herpetoculture in any way. It was a conservation-based lab. And the graduate students, we would all have field sites that we did our research on that were like all over the state. And my field site was about 2.5 hours away from Huntington. That's the city that Marshall's in. And Dr. Pauly, late in my degree, basically met me at the field site, and we were walking around talking about parts of my project. And then the person that drove me there left, and then I got to drive home with Dr. Pauly for like 2.5 hours. And we all cherished if we got Pauly time alone, because like it's like talking to our Jedi master, if you know what I'm saying.
Right.
And I was driving home, and he asked me, like, what do you want to do in the future? And I was saying I want to study snakes, and pit vipers seem pretty cool because I've been a snake guy my entire life. And then he just kind of out of the middle of nowhere said to me, well, you know, I've been watching you, and don't limit yourself just to reptiles, because you can, I'm paraphrasing, but you can nerd out on anything. Like, I watched you dig in the dirt and identify isopods, and this is before anybody knew it. Like, today, everybody knows what an isopod is, but back then, nobody knew what an isopod was. And so he basically said, like, pick a group that nobody studies and be the guy. And then if you do that professionally, you're not going to have to worry about anything because you're the only person that people go to. And so that's why I was dabbling with all these weird, obscure invertebrates, because the other thing he told me is pick an invert, because nobody studies inverts. Everybody wants to study vertebrates. And so I did that. I dabbled with leeches, because we caught those all the time. My wife said no, and I was like, yeah, this is probably for the best. So I stopped on that. I caught a bunch of centipedes and tried to identify those. And that was kind of very eye-opening when I learned that, like, most of this one genera of centipede in West Virginia, they're not described. But when you're like, that's cool, name a new species, but at the same time, you don't have anywhere to start.
Right.
And so my lab mate caught a bunch of crayfish that were coming into her drift fences she was studying this rare salamander. The crayfish, they got into the buckets and they just murdered her salamanders. As to be expected, because basically a salamander is a Snickers bar to a crawdad. And she brought the crayfish in to the lab and slammed them down on my desk, said some very choice words that rhyme with truck, and ended it with, like, figure out what the blank these are, please. Because that was my other job. I was the guy that liked to nerd out with the dichotomous keys. And so I opened up the bucket, and they've got all these crayfish staring up at me. And I knew they weren't the crayfish that I saw in the streams around me. And at that point in time, I knew there were different species. I just knew there were burrowing crayfish and there were stream crayfish. And I identified them. And then I thought that was kind of fun. And then I started studying them. And I realized that all these methods I was learning to study herps in the field, I could apply to the crawdads. Because a crayfish it's basically the size of a frog or a salamander. And then I started doing a deep dive in the literature. And I realized that there was work being done with them, but there wasn't anybody really doing it in the late 90s and the early 2000s. There were about 6 people across the country. And then the work that was being done was conservation-based. So some of these things were getting protection. And, you know, it's an unfortunate circumstance of the world we live in. But if you want to be a biologist and you want to have funding, there has to be a shtick or an angle that's going to lead to the funding. And the angle for the crawdads was that people were realizing that there was a lot of diversity, there was a lot of undescribed diversity, and there was a lot of diversity that was imperiled, and that combo leads to funding. So as I proceeded through my master's, I was spending more and more time with the crayfish and less time with herps. And I'm eternally grateful to Dr. Pauly because he, A, had that conversation with me, and then B, he also gave me space in his lab, which as a graduate advisor today, that's completely unheard of, to basically say, take this lab bench and fill it with your crawdads and kind of explore this, because I was literally taking up lab space to study salamanders, frogs, snakes, whatever. And when I left Marshall, I still loved herpetology. and it will always be my first love biologically. But professionally, I had matured enough to realize that the crawdads were going to pay the bills. And then as I started studying the crayfish more intensively, they are 100% equal to the herps now, because they are beyond weird, quirky, wonderful animals. And I have a lot of biology ADD. Like, I like to study life history biology, and then I don't want to do that anymore, and then I want to go do a survey, and then I don't want to do that anymore, and then I want to describe a new species, and I don't want to do that anymore. With the crayfish, since there's been so little done with them, I can literally do anything with them as long as it's in a scientific framework, and it's going to be important because I'm filling some knowledge gap. And that's been a lot of fun because there isn't a research question yet that I've come up with that if I stuck with it and got to a publication, that didn't get published, because all of this is filling voids that exist currently. With herps, I was going to have to sacrifice. In the early 2000s, natural history science really wasn't appreciated. It is actually, it's having a resurgence now, which is awesome. But back then, you had to do a genetics study, or you had to do some kind of ecological modeling study. And I actually do both of those now, but that's not my cup of tea. That's not where my heart is. So I think it was good for me that I made the jump when I did. And now I've got a lab full of crayfish nerds, and I got another lab full of herp nerds, and it really doesn't get any better than that.
Right.
So,
yeah.
You know.
And it's really cool to even look at the similarities between them, and especially when it comes to like variation, both genetically, but then also in terms of like different phenotypes as well, looking from like all across like the East Coast, and then as you get down into the Southeast, it's really like I didn't even realize how much variety between the distribution in crayfish there was until like you dig deeper into it, and then also looking at kind of the literature that that you've put out there, and then also that existed before, and then seeing the evolution of that, I think is really cool, what you could see in the crayfish, but as well connects to herpetology and seeing how that kind of develops over time.
Yeah. And then the other thing that's great is that these two animal groups interact with each other. So burrowing crayfish create crayfish burrows, which then things like kirtland snakes and massasaugas and crawfish frogs and even turtles, baby turtles, neonate turtles, amphiumas, all these different herps use the crayfish burrows. So I can actually set up research projects where I get to study the two animal groups that I like. And as an example of that, one of the long-term studies that I've been doing since, I started it in 2015, so I don't know, we're 8 years in, I guess, is a long-term study of queen snakes, which are very close to our campus. And anybody that knows anything about queen snakes only eat soft-shell crayfish. So this is literally a snake that's dependent on the crawdad. So when we study them, we study the crayfish at the same time we're studying the snakes, and we kind of get an idea of the whole picture. And up until then, people that did queen snake research, they would just say crayfish. They weren't recognizing that there were 2, 3, 4 species of crayfish where these animals were living.
That's crazy.
So it's been a lot of fun doing that.
Yeah,
well.
Especially like in kind of West Virginia, it's like in an interesting part of the U.S. Where there's like streams, and then it's kind of like the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains as well. And it's just so cool that you have all this diversity in this state with all the different, species going on with reptiles, crayfish, and then even smaller invertebrates and stuff like that. But what has been like, I guess, one of the coolest field studies that you've done, like in the area, like taking your students on and really getting them to have hands-on research in the backyard of where you're at?
There's 3 that I really liked. One is we just call it we either call it the Nerodia Project or the Regina Project, because those are the 2 snake genera. So my favorite reptiles are aquatic snakes or semi-aquatic snakes. They've always been my favorite. I love water. I love like streams, swamps, marshes. And at literally the bottom of our hill, that leads up to our university, is a stream. And starting in 2015, we just started to study the common water snakes, Nerodia sipidon, and then the queen snakes, Regina septemvittata. And we study them by simply going old school. We go down, we go herping, we catch snakes, we set traps, we catch snakes, we measure the snakes, weigh the snakes, put a pit tag in the snakes, document where we caught the snakes and then we let them go. And we like rinse, recycle, repeat hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. And now we're up to about 500 animals that are marked. And that we've had quite a few recaptures. We've had animals we've caught 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times. And as you increase the number of times you catch them, as long as you take the same data, you can get a really good idea of what it is to be a common water snake or northern water snake, what it is to be a queen snake. And we're just now getting to a point where we have some really, really cool data. And then we also use radio telemetry. So we put radio transmitters in our animals and track individual animals around to kind of get an idea of what like home range size looks like. And then the behavioral ecology, like what the hell are they doing out there, for lack of a better word. And that's the kind of stuff that I like. If I could, like my dream study would just to put a transmitter in the false water cobra, which is my favorite snake, favorite reptile, and just track one endlessly. Like that would be the best thing ever, because that's how you're going to really learn what it is to be that animal. So the undergrads are the main drivers of that project. And yeah, it's going well. And then the other project that I did involves telemetry as well. Another favorite was we do a lot of work in southern West Virginia with 2 endangered crayfish, like federally protected species. And I was able to convince people to let me put radio transmitters on crayfish and track crayfish, because everybody thought this idea was beyond stupid, because everybody knows that a crawdad lives under a rock. It obviously goes under one rock and spends its whole life there. And I kept arguing that, well, we won't know that until we actually follow them around and either support or refute that hypothesis. And I am happy to say that by putting the transmitters on the crayfish, we have learned that they are far more complex in their biology than anybody thought. And they're moving hundreds of meters. Sometimes they're moving kilometers.
Wow.
But then other animals do spend their whole life under one rock. So we're trying to figure out kind of why one would choose to be under a rock all the time and another one chooses to be so dynamic in its movements. And it's been pretty cool, because what we've kind of been able to elucidate is that the boys move way more than the girls. And there's lots of animals where the males have a larger home range than the females, but they're all vertebrates. This is kind of unheard of for an arthropod. So that's what makes studying crayfish so awesome, because like this kind of biology was studied in things like wolves and bears and animals like that back in like the 1920s. And here it is 2022, 23, and we're just now figuring out this kind of applied aspect of the biology. And this is all student driven. I kind of oversee the research now. It's mostly the students that are actually out in the field doing this work. But That one was a lot of fun, because it's always fun to kind of rewrite what people think about something. And we totally got to do that.
Right. Oh, that's super cool. And then also the fact that it's student driven, that's really rare, especially at the undergrad level. But yeah, even going into refuting those claims and looking at those different inferences that you made and stuff like that, it's really cool when you get into the field and then also look at these things and then actually see it from the animal's point of view and not like putting our human knowledge onto the animals, if that makes sense. And I think we do that a lot with reptiles, but with so many other species in terms of husbandry, especially when we're keeping them at zoos and personal collections as well. But it's really cool to look at really where are these animals at? Like, what are they doing? What are they eating? Where is their natural habitat? And really looking at the natural history and then applying that to like what's actually going on with these animals instead of making inferences based off of, our own conclusions that we've made up.
Yeah, no, totally. That's literally why I do what I do.
Is there anything like else when it comes to that stuff that that you've had like just crazy paradigm shifts that you've like never thought about that comes to the research you've done that just like totally, got your mind thinking in a different way with some of these animals?
The telemetry was the big one. I also do a lot of systematics. So I've described quite a few species of crayfish, and there's this kind of eternal question in biology, which we're not going to get into because we'll finish talking like 4 days from now. But that is, what is a species? And when I was younger, I thought I knew what a species was. And now that I am older, I don't have a freaking clue what it is. I mean, I have a general guideline of what constitutes a species. And that's what happens when you study things. It's kind of the Denny Krieger effect or whatever the hell they call that.
Yeah.
Where, like, you start off, you reach a point where you're like, I know everything. And then you get your butt kicked and realize, I don't know anything.
Yeah.
I'm still learning what the hell the concept is. And that is what happens when you kind of get into it, if you know what I'm saying.
Right.
So with me, the big dogma shift is more of a dogma shift with me, and it's that question of what constitutes a species. Because with the work that I do with the crawdads, I invariably, because there's been so few people to study crayfish, get in this scenario where I catch something, and then I realize it doesn't have a Latin name. It's brand new to science. When this happened in my late 20s, early 30s, I was like, yes, oh my gosh, I never thought I would do this. This is the best thing ever. Now in my 40s, I'm kind of like, God blessed. I've got to name another one, because you can't do any ecology till the thing has a name. So kind of defining what constitutes a species genetically, morphologically, geographically, that's the thing that's been like an ever-present dogma shift in me. Some of the taxa that I described early on in my career, I look back at them now, and I don't want to say that I don't think they're valid species. I do want to say that I would see an argument for them not to be. I can defend against that argument, but the species I'm naming now are much, much tighter. Like they're because we have genetics now, and the genetics has gotten exponentially better than it was back in the day. And I just have a better idea what I'm going on, what's happening in that regard. So that would be my answer to that.
Right. Yeah. And we see that in the animal world all the time. Things are constantly getting reclassified, and then people find different localities of certain things, and they're like, oh, well, is this locality a subspecies? Is it like something else? And I could just imagine how messy that could get a lot of the time.
Very messy.
Yeah. Yeah. It must make your brain hurt.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's kind of funny because now, at this point in my life, I accept the mess.
Really?
I totally accept the fact that species delineation, that's what we call it, it's still a hypothesis. Every single species on planet Earth technically is a hypothesis, because somebody came up with a criterion that basically equilibrates to an African elephant. At some point in the history of that species, if we don't make them go extinct, they're going to start to change, or they very well might be doing it. And 1,000,000 years from now, what is an African elephant today will not be an African elephant, but the new elephant came from an African elephant. So is it an African elephant because it came from an African elephant, or is it something new? And like that, people don't really think about it that way. And we're only alive for like 80 years, if we're lucky. And we're looking at what constitutes this species in that 80-year window. And realistically, we're only looking at it maybe for 20 of those 80 years when we're biologists. And you don't know where on the species continuum that critter is. Is it just becoming a new species? Is it a well-established species? Is it at the end of its time as a species morphing into a new taxa? And coming to that realization and having the experience of doing this, you kind of get to a point where you just accept this is messy.
Right.
And that's been a lot of fun for me to sit back and watch how herpetoculture responds when a new species of snake is described or a new Eublepharis gecko is described. Because, like, herpetoculture has this interpretation often that these are absolutes when we describe a new species. And in reality, it's a hypothesis. You can support it or you can deny it. It's up to you as an individual to make the call. And I don't think people realize that.
Before we go on, I want to say thank you to our sponsors. Impeccable Gecko is a small to mid-sized family-operated hobbyist breeder operation. They specialize in leopard geckos with high-quality genetics. Their goal is to provide customers with the absolute best animals that they could produce, coupled with honest and transparent business methods. At Impeccable Gecko, integrity and animal welfare are above all else. Impeccable Gecko is a strong supporter of the Strength and Leos podcast, so follow them on social media and check out what they have available. John of Gecko Boa started early, like most of us, catching lizards and snakes in his backyard at any chance he got. Over the years, he has kept and bred more than 80 species of reptiles. In recent years, his focus has turned to specializing within the genus Eublepharus. He has worked hard to pioneer some of the most cutting-edge leopard geckos while maintaining genetic purity and honesty. He also keeps the most diverse collection of pure Eublepharus species in the world. He has coordinated with biologists around the world and has contributed DNA sampling and distribution range info to help sort out the cladistic relationships within the genus. Check out geckoboa.com for more info and available geckos. Suburban Geckos is operated by Chris Charlton. Chris's passion and enjoyment for herpetoculture, and more specifically, leopard geckos, drove the desire to take his hobby to the next level. With experience in breeding and raising reptiles well over 20 years, Chris is dedicated to producing quality animals for both the hobbyist and breeder alike. Suburban Geckos treats each animal with the utmost care and respect, and cuts no corners when it comes to health and integrity of their geckos. What started off as just a couple aquariums has grown into quite the collection in just a few years, and they wouldn't have it any other way. The dedication to their animals is unparalleled and evident in the quality and health of their animals that they produce. Exemplary customer service is another area where they excel. They're readily available to answer any questions you may have regarding their animals, husbandry, and etc. For more info and to see their availability, check out suburbangeckos.com. Blizzy-billed Leos, while new to the scene, is taking strides in following the footsteps of top-tier breeders and keepers in care and ethics while aspiring to bring fresh looks and crosses to explore latent potential. Prior to becoming a breeder, Greg of Blizzy-billed Leos completed hours of extensive research on lines, ethics, morphs, and how certain traits interact with others in order to begin projects which are coming to fruition already in the second season of breeding. With a major focus on line breeding the correct way and customer service done right, Blizzy-billed Leos aspires to be a breath of fresh air to the customers and keepers they encounter. Be sure to check out their Instagram, Blizzy-billed Leos, and stay up to date on project development, availability, or just tips on having healthy animals in your care. Dab Exotics is a hobbyist breeding operation that was started in 2017. They specialize in producing healthy leopard geckos from top quality genetics. Dab Exotics is an awesome supporter of the Strength in Leos podcast, so follow them on social media and check out what they have available for sale. Shane Kelly is a blue-collar, working-class guy that has a reptile breeding business with his wife and kids. They are currently working with high-quality ball python morphs, western hognose snakes, and select leopard geckos with a focus on bold stripes, and they're looking forward to adding Albie Snow and Ghost this year. They have been listening to the podcast since the beginning and are proud to be a Season 4 sponsor. Go check out their social media, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and also check out their morph market to see what they have available.
Within your community, would you say people are embracing this mess, or are people like, does this mess bring like anxiety?
I could speak from personal experience. Both. That is the correct answer to that question. On the one hand, if you have results that are like really strong genetically and really strong with geography, so those genes are kind of found in one place and you can define that place, and then that animal has something new about it. It's a different color, it's got a new horn, it has some tubercles in my crayfish world, bumps in a certain place in a certain pattern. That's not anxiety inducing. Like, that is a clear cut as you're going to get. That's something that we should move forward with a description. But at the same time, you can get these examples where it's like really strong genetic evidence that it's different, no morphological evidence that it's different, but these genes map out in a specific place on the planet that makes sense for them being isolated. And that's when you're dealing with something like a cryptic species. And those are the ones that are anxiety inducing, because you know, based off your field of study, that this thing is different. But at the same time, there's going to be critics that are going to say no. And they're going to say no because I can't see a difference. Realistically, we don't really know how important it is to see a physical difference. So that's the one, like, those scenarios are the ones that make you lose sleep at night, because you've got to make a judgment call. And in my world, I'm making a judgment call and describing an animal that probably lives in an Appalachian waterway, because that's where my focus is, the Appalachians. And some parts of Appalachia are protected, and the streams are in good shape. The animals are safe. In other parts of Appalachia, the streams are incredibly degraded. We've done an awful lot of extractive industry, timbering, mining, gas extraction. Those rivers are not healthy. And if you don't describe this population, that's the only way you're going to get a potential protection. At the same time, you might be accused of describing the population as kind of an environmentalism response to industry, and you don't want that on your reputation if you're trying to be an objective, academic. And that whole soup of humanity is what makes it anxiety-inducing.
Yeah,
it's not the science; it's how people respond to your idea is what the problem is.
Yeah, and that's really tough when you're like, even sometimes you don't even know what's going on, and you're like trying to figure this out, and at the same time you don't want all this harm from outside, outside people getting into like stakeholders and things like that, and that could also get it messy, I could imagine, from your point of view. Yeah,
totally, 100%.
Nice. Well, I kind of wanted to talk to you a little bit about most of the people on this podcast, a lot of reptile people in general, but specifically leopard geckos in general. And I know just with your knowledge, and you've done a lot of you have a lot of knowledge on crypto and whatever. It's a lot that goes along with crypto. It's very divisive, especially in herps and people and their collections and things like that. So with crypto, what is your background on crypto? And then also for people who aren't familiar with crypto, can you kind of describe a little bit about what it is?
Yeah. So whenever I do crypto on a podcast, I always start with a disclaimer. First and foremost, veterinarians know more than me. And we need to always default to their knowledge base. They have the training to do pathology in reptiles. They have the training to understand what's happening physiologically, what the organism's doing, how do I detect it, all that kind of goodness. So whenever I talk about what I did with crypto, my stuff, I approached crypto kind of from the angle of an ecologist, not a veterinarian. So I kind of look at populations, and what I'm talking about is like a closed population, which is what a captive population of organisms is. And I'm kind of interested in how it goes from animal to animal. And I'm also interested in what does it mean when an animal has crypto? And then how is it ultimately passed? Now, other disclaimer, all the work I've done to date is with snakes, but I have invariably worked with Cryptosporidium verinae, which is the one that basically infects lizards more than anything. So this kind of goes back to the winter of 2018. Right around this time, January, we had some snakes that started to regurgitate mice that we were feeding. And they were all colubrids, and they were in this small room that we refer to as a snake lab. And one aspect of having an animal collection that is taken care of by too many people is that little subtle mistakes are made, and not everybody has the nuance that it takes to be a herp keeper. So oftentimes we'll say things like, feed that snake a small adult mouse, and then we invariably feed it an adult mouse, and then the animal has a prey item that's too large, and then that leads to a regurgitation. And so at first, when the regurgitations were happening, I was under the impression that we were just feeding our corn snakes mice that were too big. And then after I realized, like, we've had 3 regurges in a row, surely to God the people weren't making the mistake anymore, I basically kicked everybody out of the lab and I took over. And sure enough, I noticed that the animals were regurging. And I also noticed that they were they were still defecating, but the defecations were this like mucusy, gross poop that didn't really have any kind of form. And I then had to go and figure out what the hell was going on with our animals. So I just came to my office, sat down, and grabbed my copy of Fry, which is the great big veterinary book for reptiles, and started looking at gastrointestinal disorders. I invariably ended up on the crypto in the crypto chapter, and there's like diagnostic characteristics of crypto is in there, and I was like, check. And then I was like, all right, so what does this mean? So like when I initially engaged this disease, I just knew I knew two things. I know Cryptosporidium was really bad for people that had AIDS because it wipes them out. And I knew that Cryptosporidium in humans that have a good immune system just kind of gives you diarrhea, and that's the extent of it. So I didn't even know much about it in animals. And then I started learning, reading, and I needed to confirm that it was crypto. So we did this thing called an acid fast stain. We have a microbiology department, but we have 4 microbiologists here. So I was like, how do I find this on a scope? And so they said, acid fast staining, here's what you need. Some of them actually helped me. And sure enough, very quickly identified it as a Cryptosporidium. We didn't know what species we had. We just know we definitely had crypto. And then I proceeded to watch the pathology of crypto. And that's when that's when the fear started to come in, because in a matter of like a month, we went from a thriving colubrid snake colony to animals weren't dead yet, but animals, to be humane, absolutely needed to be put down. And so we ended up putting down a lot of our collection, and it just slowly kind of worked its way through all of our typical colubrid snakes. So it took out the corn snakes, they were the first ones. Then it took out our bull snakes. Then it took out, we had these beautiful, massive black-tailed crebos, wiped them out in a matter of less than a week. They had no symptoms. They had symptoms, and then they were dead. And so I started reading a lot, and the biggest thing I wanted to do was stop the spread. And so that's when I learned about what it takes to deactivate crypto, and then what crypto's life cycle is. And this animal, it's a protozoan or protist. It's a really weird, complex bug. It undergoes an asexual reproduction phase where basically you get spores. That's what they're called. Spores, sorry. It only takes a handful of spores, like 5 to 20 spores ingested for the infection to take place. To put that in perspective, to get a bacterial infection, it takes thousands of bacteria to millions. So that was horrifying. And then I learned that it is damn near impossible to kill. And the word that we actually use technically is deactivate, because you don't even really kill them when you think you're killing them. And I knew that we had a problem. So we shut the lab down. We left all the animals in there. I consulted with a bunch of veterinarians, and they basically were like, leave the animals in there, track everybody's poop. It was a horrible situation because I didn't want to take animals out because it's so contagious. I didn't want to pull the infection out. But at the same time, I hated leaving animals in there that weren't showing any symptoms. And that's when I kind of realized I got to understand the biology of this bug a little bit more. And I did a deep dive into vectors. So, like, how do the spores go from cage to cage? And it turns out that most crypto is spread by keepers. So, keep in mind, like 5 to 20 spores, when a animal poops, it can shed up to 1 million spores. And you only need 5 to 20 of these things to cause an infection. So the odds are in the favor of the crypto. And what happens is you get it on your fingers. You don't even realize you have it on your fingers. And then you're cleaning water bowls. You're dumping substrate. You're doing spot cleaning. You inoculate that tank in that process. And then the leopard gecko, in this case, is going to be chemosensing. We've all watched our geckos walk around at night dabbing their tongue. And if it dabs its tongue on the substrate that has 20 spores on it, which take up like a couple microns of space, now we have a crypto infection. And then I learned that the other vector, this was like horrifying to me, was flies. So no, I'm not talking about fruit flies. I'm talking about these little things look like fruit flies, but are called phorid flies. If you have a reptile collection and you keep your animals in racks, phorids have a tendency to seek those racks out, because when the animals poop, you don't have as much air exchange, but what exchange is coming out relieves the scent of poo. The phorids fly through that poo smell, follow it, they get in, and what ends up happening is they're running all over the poop, getting spores all over their legs, and then everywhere they land, they deposit more spores. So if you have a phorid infestation, or just phorids in your collection, they're going to be flying around, running around, and you can't control where they go, and they're spreading the spores all over the place. So I then learned that bleach, don't even think about using bleach. It's a total waste of time. It just tickles crypto. It doesn't really kill them at all.
That's crazy.
Ammonia at a high density or high concentration, it will kill crypto, or sorry, should be saying kill. It will deactivate the spores, but things have to soak in that for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. The only thing that the research that I was able to get my hands on that was found to truly deactivate it and attempt to stop it were hydrogen peroxide at 12% or higher. So a lot of people, they hear me say this stuff and they're like, oh, cool, I can go to CVS. The peroxide that you get at the grocery store is 6%. And the reason why I know this is if you've ever worked with food grade peroxide, which is the 12%, you voluntarily put peroxide on a wound to clean it. If you put 12% peroxide on your hand, it's going to burn you and it hurts like hell because it's extremely caustic. So that reaction that you see is able to basically get into past the spore coat and get into the inside of the organism and nuke the nucleus and stop it. So, and that's the only thing that you can use to effectively sterilize, but you have to put the 12% peroxide on a surface, and it has to be on the surface for 10 minutes before it's going to kill stuff. And if you're spritzing 12% peroxide around and you've got like delicate electrical equipment, it can corrode wires and contacts of like heat pads and racks, and it can cause problems there. So the other way that the best way, and fortunately it's free to kind of stop it, is to use UV. So if you get crypto and you pull your stuff out into a bright sunshiny day, the sun literally takes it out. So there, we're kind of like, oh my gosh, this is great, miracle cure. The problem is, if you think about enclosures, they have little nooks and crannies. So if you have like PVC enclosures, you kind of screw those things together where the bottom meets the side, there's a gap. And it doesn't even look like a gap to you, but keep in mind how small the cryptospores are. The spores get down into that gap. You have to ensure that the entire tank is irradiated with sunlight. So what this means is you pull your enclosures out. In the case of our collection, we had all PVC enclosures. We took everything outside. We took them all apart, and we quite literally moved each piece of the enclosure to a different angle each day. And we did this over a 2-week period of time. We kept the animals in temporary tubs. And that was after we soaked everything with the 12% peroxide. And then we tested afterwards, and we were able to halt the spread of crypto. But that doesn't mean that we didn't have animals that were infected and were what we call non-clinical. So they weren't showing evidence of having crypto. And, I learned all of this by doing and living a really rough 6-month period of time. The other thing about crypto that I think is worthy of saying right now, and I know this is kind of, it's organized but all over the place at the same time, is that you can absolutely have animals that have crypto and they are not showing any clinical signs. And those are what we refer to as asymptomatic. And in that situation, those animals will every now and then pass a mucousy poop. So they're like, perfect. There's a mucousy poop. And you as a keeper just think, oh, it's a one-off, it's not a big deal. Well, in reality, that mucousy poop could actually be what causes a crypto infection throughout your collection. So the best thing to do in all these instances is, quarantine. So I learned all of this, and I spent my spring break that semester. We went and bought Tyvek suits. I got all the peroxide I could get my hands on. I grabbed steamers, and I basically waged war on the snake room. I steamed the hell out of everything. The steaming isn't necessarily to kill the crypto, but it gets in all the little imperfections of the enclosures, and it kind of pulls the spores out. So then when you hit it with the 12% hydrogen peroxide or the UV, the spores are exposed to be killed or deactivated. But we did that. We steamed the room. We covered the wall. We covered everything in peroxide. That was horrible. You breathe it in, and it burns your lungs. I stained up more hoodies than I can talk about. It went through the Tyvek, which was crazy.
Wow.
But we were able, like I said, to stop it. I then learned about genetic methods because I was thinking to myself, like, I knew there were genetic strategies, but I wanted to know, like, do we have Serpentis or Veraneae? And that's where gathering samples, sending them off to research labs that can then run PCRs, which is the genetic way of identifying what the hell you have. Crypto is a royal pain in the butt to use PCR with because they have this spore, and you've got to lyse the spore to dump the DNA to then get the PCR test, and there's only a couple veterinary pathophysiology peeps that know how to do that, and they, of course, are going to keep their method secret because that's what keeps their business. So we did that, and we ultimately, like I said, found out that we had Cryptosporidium serpentis. But then me being the taxonomist that I am, I sat down with one of our micro people, and I said, well, what the hell is this? Because we had Cryptosporidium serpentis. We sent a bunch of poop to get surveyed. And then we had Cryptosporidium spa, Cryptos 1, Cryptosporidium spa 2, Cryptosporidium spa 3. And it turns out that there are totally undescribed species of Cryptosporidium that are out there impacting our reptiles. So one of the things that drives me crazy is I'll every now and then I'll lurk in a group on Facebook when I see crypto pop up, and I'll read, and we have these keyboard warrior experts that are saying, like, oh no, that's Veraneae. That has to be Veraneae. It could be Veraneae. It could be an undescribed species of Cryptosporidium. It could be 3 undescribed species of Cryptosporidium. It doesn't appear that the species really matters. The only thing that, as far as the pathology, what really matters, though, is Serpentis is really good at infecting one group of animals. Veraneae is really good at infecting another group of animals. Veraneae is the one, I believe, that's in fact impacting leopard geckos. But Veraneae is also the species of crypto that is rampant in hognose snakes if they have crypto. So please, like, it's crazy the adaptability of this pathogenic organism to get into a reptile and cause harm.
Yeah, like pains in the butt and like so many different ways. Like even just hearing your story, I was like, to go through that, like that must have been insane to like not only like dealing with it, but trying to figure out what it is, how it's spreading, and the fact even like how it could be asymptomatic in an animal and you might not even know until like maybe it gets stressed out or it, you know, like you said, a mucousy poop every once in a while. And even like just the fact of knowing that, it's like, what defense do we have against this thing? It's kind of crazy to just think about.
Yeah, well, with all the work that I've done, and then being a good scientist, like I said earlier in the podcast, I know I don't know everything. I know there are absolutely people on this planet that know way more than me about Cryptosporidium, and I have sought them out, and I've asked them questions, and a couple of them are now my friends because I ask them so many questions. But one of the things that the people that are dealing with crypto and really doing deep dives on it we're all kind of coming to this realization is that when an animal gets crypto, it's somewhat disingenuous to think it's going to leave it. And that is scary to people that have these animals. It's extremely scary to breeders whose purpose it is to generate the stock that then the keepers are going to keep. And if you have, you know, a colony of 100 plus leopard geckos and you find out somebody has crypto in it, or kind of the knee-jerk reaction is to get the poop, send it away, confirm presence, and then euthanize. And I've even had people in zoo settings, ACA settings, when I was talking about this, and they quite literally said, you know, our strategy with crypto is to like execute Order 66 like they did in, you know, Star Wars, right, and just kill everything in that room quickly, attack the room or create what's called a crypto ward, where you quite literally have a dedicated space where all the crypto animals go. And then that presents issues because you have to be very disciplined and diligent and make sure like that's the last room that you do any work in. You manage the animals appropriately so that you're not working with the crypto animals first, getting the spores on you, you're going in another space and you cause crypto. So my approach has changed over the past 5 years now, in that I've learned some things, and it's a little bit controversial by some people's standards, but I think that with crypto, that when you get to the point that you have mucousy poops, or in leopard geckos, I forget the term you all use, but you can look at an animal, and leopard geckos are one of the few species that you can visually look at and get a really good indication that thing is essentially terminal with crypto. The tail withers down to damn near nothing. Right. They're going to look really, really, really emaciated. They're still going to eat. They will regurge a little bit too, and then you're going to have like runny poo. When you get to that point, that is probably a situation where you need to go to a vet, have a conversation, and you might be talking about euthanasia. With other animals, though, please do not think it's not in your collection, because you didn't realize that animal had crypto before it had those symptoms. And so you're handling it, you're treating it like it's not diseased. It doesn't show those symptoms until the very end of the disease pathology. So another strategy, which is the controversial strategy, is if we manage stress with our colony, they can have crypto, but they're not going to have it at a lethal level. It's going to be a subacute level. It's going to be kind of in the background. It's always there. But if the animals are not stressed, stress is what leads to the immune system falling, which then the crypto realizes, haha, I can take over. And then you get that crazy pathology. And there's definitely some evidence of like stress management is the better way. That's all well and good in a research setting, but we're in the business of breeding animals, and then you take that stock and then you sell it to somebody else. That's where the ethical question comes into play.
Right.
Like, are you selling this animal that has crypto now? But I promise you, people do not realize they have crypto when they're selling their offspring.
Wow.
One of the studies that I really want to do, and I will do it inevitably, I don't have time to do it now. This is one that I can do when I'm not able to run up and down a creek, is that I want to do a study where I literally have people anonymously send in poop samples, because I would love to understand the background rate of infection for crypto. And the thing is, if you're taking care of your geckos, they could have crypto, but they're not stressed out. So if they're not stressed out, the organism's not going to flare up. And that's why I think that like it's way more common in people's collections than we realize.
Yeah, which is scary to think about, because it's like it's at the reptile shows. It's when you're going to your buddy's collection. It's everywhere, and when you have it in your collection and you're dealing with, especially I think with lizards, some of the literature I was reading up on in terms of feeder insects. That's another big way that they act as vectors, and using the a cricket jumps on the leopard gecko and they get those spores, and then somehow the cricket gets out, and then you're like, oh, I don't want to waste the cricket, so I'm going to feed it to another gecko, and then it's another way that this stuff is spreading, and it's really crazy to think about not only how easily it could get passed on, but like as us not sending in these PCR tests that we may have it in our collections and don't even know it, which is really crazy. Yeah,
no, absolutely. Here at the university, we have had several snakes that they tested positive for crypto, because we screen the entire collection. It is incredibly expensive, but we do it anyway. And we've gone with the crypto ward approach. So if you pop positive, you go to a room that is multiple floors away from everybody else. It has 2 doors. Only experienced students work in there, and it's actually normally the conservation students, not even the zoo-side students, because they're not working with the animals, but they kind of they were zoo-side students at one time before they became conservation students. And what's been really interesting to me is like many of those snakes, their husbandry is spot on, so they're not stressed out, and they defecate, and it's the most perfect poop you've ever seen. They don't have any phenotypic evidence, not phenotypic, they don't have any evidence, diagnostic evidence of having a Cryptosporidium infection, and we absolutely know it's in there.
That's crazy.
And some of those animals have had it some of them are from the original infection. And we send away their poops, and every time they pop positive, so that's been pretty intriguing. We did a little bit of research with a drug. So the Bronx Zoo got in a king cobra that had Cryptosporidium, and they didn't want to euthanize the snake because it was a really rare locality. And so what they did is they put it into a quarantine facility, and then they basically were kind of doing a broad screening of antibiotics to see if there was something that would get rid of it. And they used this drug called paromomycin, and then they basically would deliver it straight into the gut. So they would put a tube down the king's throat and then deliver the medicine right into the stomach where the crypto was theorized to be living. And then they did this quite frequently, and then they would basically they'd feed the snake would poop, they would then send the poo away, and to a PCR testing, and then they looked and basically wanted to see, can we get to a point where we're not getting crypto tests anymore? And they did. And so they kind of were like, oh my gosh, we may have the cure here. And so they kept testing months out from the initial negative, and they never got a positive again. And so they they were very good in their writing. They were extremely diplomatic. It's a well-written paper because they did not say that it was cured. What they said was it was asymptomatic, and it was not spreading spores, because the likelihood of getting a spore out of the stomach of one of these of the king cobra, if it's not shedding in the disease pathology state, is very low. So that basically the snake could still have the spores in it, but it's not shedding them when it defecates. Therefore, it's not contagious, but it's still infected. And there's really no way to prove that without euthanizing the snake. So that's kind of the way you got to be with crypto. And I unfortunately have realized that the vast majority of herpetoculturalists in the private sector kind of do the scorched earth approach once you find out that you have crypto. And it does kind of, I understand it to a point, but I think that if we're managing stress and we're really honestly questioning ourselves, what are the best husbandry practices for this animal, and employing them, that's a good way to mitigate the stress. And if you mitigate the stress, the animals aren't going to be shedding the spores if they have them as frequently, or maybe not at all. And that's a way to mitigate the inevitable crypto infection. Because I will go on record saying, if you are bringing new animals in from outside sources, crypto is something that can live in the animal through a 60, 90-day quarantine. And if you have a large collection and you're grabbing these animals from all over the place, if I had to bet as to whether you had crypto in there or not, I will bet 99 times out of 100 that you have it. You're just doing a good job mitigating it.
Yeah. You just dropped a big bomb on a lot of people. Broke some hearts.
Yeah. And that's why I get really angry. Not angry. Well, no, angry might be the right word. Because we're so cutthroat in the private sector. Yeah, I don't experience this, you don't know what you're talking about, sit down garbage when I'm talking with other people like the zoo vets that I work with. I've had ideas that were dead wrong, and that's fine. We tested them. We found out they were wrong. We moved on to another idea. Having crypto in your collection is like a scarlet letter in herpetoculture. And sure, if you are selling people that leopard geckos that obviously have a withered tail, obviously have all the diagnostic cues of crypto, you're an asshole. I'm saying that out loud. But if you sell somebody an animal and it didn't show any stress, think about how stressful it is from a leopard gecko's perspective. It lives in whatever it lives in. All's well in the universe. It may have been raised in this particular tub, tank, whatever, and then you sell it. You're now going to take that animal out of the home it's known forever, put it in a deli cup, put it in a box, ship it across the country. It's going to be grabbed by somebody else 24 hours later, put into a new place with new smells, new temperatures, new food, new everything. I don't care what you are, you're going to have a stress response. And that animal that didn't show any symptoms of Cryptosporidium in the original owner's home is now so stressed out it doesn't eat, and that's the exact condition crypto needs to, like, flare. And so then it flares, you send away the test, and then you're so pissed off at this, breeder that doesn't know what the hell they're talking about, and blah, blah, blah. And in reality, it's just a product of circumstance with getting the animal from point A to point B. If you really, really, really are hell-bent on not having crypto in your collection, you're truly hell-bent. The only way that I would suggest that you try to keep it out is I would not buy any leopard gecko from a reptile show, and I would ask a breeder online if he or she or they are willing to send the poo away to get tested. And you have to do that. If you get a negative, you've got to do it 2 more times because there's false positives. And that is going to cost you about $75 to $100.
Wow.
If you get 3 negative tests, you at least know that the animal's not shedding spores. And then you can bring that animal in. But keep in mind, a negative test does not mean it doesn't have crypto.
Right. And that's another thing. It may still have crypto, but not shedding spores.
So, I've kind of changed my perspective on this a lot. An awful lot.
Yeah, and I could see why. I think people sometimes, we think about crypto as like this one big thing, but even thinking about different variants of this organism and then looking at different species of our different variants of crypto, and we see what we know about it and the things that we don't know. I feel like there's so much more that we don't know about crypto than the actual facts that we do know and how it's spreading within various collections. And even if this thing is like going cross species, like you mentioned before, hognose snakes, and is this the hognose getting to the leopard geckos and then vice versa to other places? And people honestly just don't know, so that's where they're filling in the gaps with their own BS about whatever's happening.
And remember that the people that I consider to be experts on crypto will be the first people to tell you we barely understand this organism,
which is the scary part too about it.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
right. It's and in the private sector, people kind of think that I'm this wealth of knowledge. I don't think I am. I think I have really good friends that are in academia. They're the wealth of knowledge. I'm just kind of running on their shoulders, if that makes sense.
Right, yeah. But even just getting that information out there, I think a lot of people, especially on social media these days, people want to get reactions, knee-jerks, or even ways to tell people that, like, oh, yeah, put bleach on it. Bleach kills everything, 99.9% of germs and bacteria, all that good stuff. And they're like, okay, you'll be fine, even if, an animal has it, and eventually it'll get rid of it. And these rumors start spreading and things like that. But we have to really look at the facts and what's actually happening as we're observing it in these AZA facilities from these veterinarians who are out there doing the research and putting out this literature on crypto. Yeah.
As an example, since I study this organism, I had some people reach out to me that had hognose snakes. And in the snake world, if there's any community that is battling crypto and they're in like the trenches with it right now, it is absolutely the plains hogs, western hognose snake breeders of the world, and keepers. And these people had animals that had Cryptosporidium. They had sent the tests away, got confirmation that they had crypto. They were able to manage the stress. The animals kind of rebounded. They weren't having any kind of bad poops. They sent the poos away again, and then they started to get negatives. But they just didn't like the fact that they had these animals that had at one time tested positive for Cryptosporidium, and they wanted to know if I wanted them because we have the animals here that have crypto. And I thought, this is great. This is like an opportunity to study the stress of shipping an animal. Like, does that induce crypto? Because here I have animals that are literally across the country that were tested, were negative. The people were great. They did 3 tests. They did everything they needed to do. Every indication was that they did not have crypto. But keep in mind, you have those spores in your gut. What really that means is you're not shedding crypto, but you could still have it. And so they shipped me the snakes, and I did not want to induce crypto. I wanted to see if I could get them here and mitigate the stress of shipping. That's a 48-hour, it was a 24-hour period of time. But you also have the first 24 hours where they end up back in the new place, and you're taking them out of the cage and they're getting all the new smells, all that kind of goodness. And what was interesting to me is they did not show any evidence of crypto for the first 2 months. And then at the 2-month period, they started to stop eating. They ate again. And then, boom, all the stress of that event, we thought it's all well and good. But here the animals are, and it manifested itself 2 months later. And sure enough, these animals that didn't show crypto signs for a couple years, with the previous keeper, they're defecating liquid, they're vomiting up their mice. They actually had one of the rarer things to see, which is a swelled up stomach.
Wow.
And sure enough, we weren't able to save them after that. So I quite literally lived the experience that many people talk about, where I got this animal from a breeder and da-da-da, and I can flat out tell you that the person that sent me that hognose snake, they're wonderful human beings. They're not a breeder, so I don't want anybody out there that keeps hognose thinking like, who the hell is it? Not a breeder. It was a keeper. But that's just an example of how this works.
Wow.
So.
Yeah, that's really crazy to think about, like what that means for breeders now. Like in terms of people are always talking about quarantines, or even you could be the best quarantiner of quarantines and have your own separate room and new racks and whatever you want to do. But there's still the inevitable fact of how this thing works and how it interacts with animals and how difficult it is to get rid of this thing. So it puts a lot of things into perspective, but also in terms of testing, like, are people going to get more into testing? How is testing going to look? Because it is expensive. Is there ways to get testing down? And then also the fact that only a few people are doing this testing, and the fact that you have to do multiple tests and things like that. So it's like a big headache for breeders, and what that actually means for private keepers really in the hobby.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Pretty much nailed it there.
Right. Nice. Well, I really appreciate that just that rundown on crypto. I think a lot of people, especially in leopard geckos, there was a big time where at one point everybody was getting really impacted with crypto, and not just impacted, but showing symptoms. And a lot of people didn't really know how it manifested itself within leopard geckos, but also knowing, more literature is being produced on it. Well, it's good to have kind of an outlook of what else could be produced in the future in terms of research and how this is going to impact the hobby in the major point.
Mm-hmm. And I'm dabbling with Cryptosporidium research. I'm working with a veterinarian who's at the Central Florida Zoo, and I would consider him the expert on crypto without question. And he's also, we're kind of talking about the possibility of doing a project or two together. But who knows? Maybe I'll jump from snakes to leopard geckos. So there you go.
Yeah, no, that'd be awesome. And adding more projects on your plate, I know you're going to be busy well into. I heard biologists never really retire; they just move on to new projects.
No, I tell people all the time, when I am teaching people and when I am like working with the animals, I don't want to retire from that. That's the best. I'm my department's chair, which means I have to do a lot of people management. I will retire from that faster than my head will spin. So that's what I will retire from. But I will never
people versus reptiles.
It's
easy choice.
Yeah, no, 100%. I will choose the reptiles 100 times out of 100.
I think a lot of people listening to this will do the same.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Nice. Well, Zach, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast, using your time and your information and resources, really just sharing that with people. I hope a lot of people really get a lot of great information for that and what you shared today. So I really appreciate you coming on.
Sure. Anytime.
Nice. Well, at the end of each episode, we kind of do a quick this or that round where we just ask a few questions, and whatever pops into your mind first will be your answer. So are you cool to do that right quick?
Sure.
Nice. So you're a morning person or a night owl? Okay.
Can you be both?
I guess, yeah.
I'm
Sounds like with
technically-
what's on your plate, you have to be.
It literally depends on what I'm doing. I don't mind getting up. I get up every morning at 5,
Wow.
and then I'm in bed by midnight. So I don't need much sleep to do what
That's
I do.
crazy. Wow. Okay, are you coffee or a tea person?
Coffee,
Coffee. Okay. Snakes or lizards?
snakes. Sorry,
Okay.
guys. It's like,
Thanks. You might get a few hey messages from that.
yeah, I know.
Just kidding. Do you like a winter better or do you like summer better?
That's a great question. Spring is technically my favorite. I don't like to be hot,
Okay.
so I can handle cold.
Got
that
it.
doesn't bother. So I would say, but I love summer. But at the same time, I don't want to be hot.
Okay.
I'm not
Nice.
doing a good job with this and that.
Got it. iPhone or Android?
Android.
Books or TV?
Ooh. Books.
Okay. Favorite aspect of biology?
That is a heavy question, man. I love how messy it is. That's my favorite aspect because I'm not a type A person. I'm definitely more of a type B person, so I can handle disorder. And the more and more and more you dive into biology, the more and more you realize it is so ungodly complicated, and we suck at interpreting it. And that is just flipping wonderful as
Yeah.
far as I'm concerned.
Nice. Micro or macro?
Macro.
Okay. And favorite reptile morph of all time, any species?
A normal false water cobra.
Normal. Nice.
I'm a biologist, man. I like the phenotype that evolution made on pretty much everything. If I
Right.
had a favorite phenotype or favorite morph, I guess I do like hypo, just old fashioned hypo bull snakes. Hypomelanistic
Okay.
bull snakes are kind of
Nice.
cool. That's one. But with my favorite snake, I don't really like the morphs all that much. People lose their mind over lavenders. I have one. My favorite are my normals. So
Well, type for the win.
That's my answer.
Nice. Well, again, thanks for coming on. For people who are kind of more interested in what you do, your research, want to read more about just who you are and the things that you're doing, how could they get more information on that?
Yeah, sure. So you can find me on Facebook, just Zach Loafman. You can find me on Instagram. I'm Dr. Crawdad on Instagram. You can totally message me there. I communicate with my graduate students with Facebook Messenger, and I have a couple reptile chats that I'm in Instagram on, and that's kind of my way of decompressing in the middle of a day when I have to deal with people. You can. I'm always willing to take on grad students to ask any question in herpetoculture. I have students that are working with snakes, lizards. I don't have a turtle student yet, but I'm about to. I have somebody working with dart frogs and red-eyed tree frogs for their thesis, so it's kind of all over the place. And I have somebody actually that's working with crested geckos. So we are in the Geckoda. So you can feel free to message me about that stuff through Facebook or Instagram. You don't have to write a big, swanky, formal email. I'm extremely down to earth, and I will happily respond. But if you want to email me, it's zloafman@westliberty.edu. And then I have my own podcast, which is called Colubrid and Colubroid Radio, which is on the Morelia Python Network. So, lots of places where you can find me.
Nice. So again, appreciate your time, and hopefully we'll see you back on the podcast.
Now I'll come back. Maybe I'll keep some leopard geckos over the next year, and you can have me back on then.
Yeah, we got to get you some of that cool stuff too. The different species of Eublepharus, not just the normal.
Oh
ones.
yeah. No, the gigantic Leos. I forget what the species name is.
The
but those
Angramanu?
guys that are in Iran.
Yeah,
Agramanu. Yeah. No. I'm definitely interested in those.
those things are sick.
So.
Yeah, you can get Afghans
Yes,
that
they
are
are thick.
tiny, as big as an Angramanu's tail, and then you get the Angramanu that's a foot long.
Yeah, I saw them at Tinley this year, and I knew they existed, but seeing them in person was pretty damn cool.
Yeah, once you get to hold one, it's you're like you have a dinosaur, literally a dinosaur in your hand. That's a leopard gecko.
Yep, exactly.
Nice. Well, again, I appreciate you, and have a good one.
Yep, thank you for having me.